Warning, today's video contains images that some may consider disturbing. Viewer discretion is advised. The summit of Mount Everest is the highest point on Earth, currently at 29,032 feet. And over 300 people have died trying to get to the summit, or that highest point. And over 2/3 of those people, their bodies remain there still today. Some are covered in deep snow and only visible during certain times when the ice melts enough, or they are not found at all. And others serve as morbid landmarks for other climbers. This is going to be a two-part story about the 1996 Adventure Consultants expedition, and today I will be talking about Beck Weathers, the man who narrowly escaped Everest with his life. This is SOSAD, Stories of Survival and Death, a series where I talk about people in horrific situations, their lives, and how they either survived or died in that situation. So if that interests you, please like and subscribe, and let's get into today's video. Beck Weathers was born Seaborn Beck Weathers on December 16th, 1946 in Griffin, Georgia to Arthur and Emily Weathers. He was the middle of three boys. He had an older brother, Kit, and a younger brother, Dan, and he was closest to his brother, Dan. And Dan really looked up to him because he saw him as very competitive and smart, and he was also very caring, and he really cared about Dan and wanted to make sure that he was okay. He would ask him about his feelings, and he was very supportive of him. And he and Dan were really close in age too. I think they were only like a year and a half to 2 years apart. So they grew up really close together, and they were part of a military family, so they moved around a lot growing up. They lived in Japan, San Antonio, France, Saudi Arabia, Dallas, and that's just part of being in the military. So he never really had any friends that he was super close with, so he was really close to Dan. Beck was really eager to learn, and he entered first grade at 5 because he wanted to attend real school, and he just saw kindergarten as just pretend school, I guess. He was also nearsighted, so he had to sit at the front of class, and he really liked this because he loved attention, and being near the front of class gave him more opportunity to be in the spotlight. Beck and his family were very active. They loved being outdoors, and Beck liked hiking, fishing, hunting, and he was in the Boy Scouts for some time. He was seen as a risk taker and a deep thinker, and he loved intellectual conversation and participated in theater and debate in high school. He graduated in 1964, and then he went to Midwestern State, and he soon found that he would actually have to apply himself in school in order to earn good grades. But he adjusted quickly to that and did very well. Despite his outgoing, talkative, and active personality, Beck struggled with depression his entire life. And he never had a strong self-image. He saw himself as a bright dweeb, and he lived his life in what he described as a steady state. He wasn't ever really happy with where he was or what he had done or who he was. He was always looking towards the future, towards these goals, thinking that once he achieved this, he'd be happy, but he was never happy with the things that he had achieved. He contemplated suicide many times throughout his life, but I don't think he ever actually made an attempt. I think his daring actions were more done with a disregard for his life than actually trying to end it. And he never let it stop him from achieving his goals. He still did really well in his life. He was very motivated to do things, but he just never was happy. After he graduated Midwestern, he decided he wanted to go into pathology, and so he went to University of Texas Southwestern Med School because he had a scholarship there. And in 1974, he met Margaret Olson, who was one of his brother Kit's patients, and his roommates started referring to her as Georgia Peach, and then it was eventually shortened to Peach. So now everyone just calls her Peach. They were married on April 24th, 1976, and by 1981 they had 2 children, Beck and Meg. And Beck still struggled with his depression, and Peach kind of felt like it was something that she was doing wrong, and she hated how absent he was from their lives because he would go and do things trying to cope with his depression, trying to ease it, but it always took him away from his family. He would throw himself into these activities, but it was always without them, and he was always gone. He wasn't really ever a part of his family's life. He got into sailing, and then in his mid-30s, he found mountain climbing, and he absolutely loved mountain climbing. This became an obsession for him. It was one of the only places he felt at peace, and he started putting all of his time and energy into getting into shape for climbing. He'd wake up at 4:30 in the morning. He would exercise, he'd go to work as a pathologist, and he'd come home around 6, and then he would go to bed at 8:30. And this was just his daily routine. And he didn't really spend time with his family. He didn't really talk to them very much. He loved them, but he just wasn't ever there. He was always off doing whatever he wanted to do or whatever he needed to do to cope with his depression. Beck saw Richard Bass as an inspiration, and he was someone who made the 7 Summits, which is a challenge, quest, achievement, whatever you want to call it, to climb the highest mountain on each continent. He made that seem attainable. And Beck decided that he wanted to do that. So he began training and scheduling out times to go climb these mountains, and he would be gone for weeks, months at a time on these climbs. When he was climbing, it was often very cold and wet and dangerous situations, and Beck saw his nearsightedness and his need for glasses kind of hazardous. So about 1.5 years before his Everest attempt, he had a radial keratotomy done, which is an operation to correct nearsightedness. And in 1996, Beck signed up with Rob Hall of Adventure Consultants for a guided climb of Mount Everest. It was a 6 to 10 week venture, and it cost about $65,000. He flew out from Dallas on March 27th to start his expedition, and he met up with his group, the guides and the Sherpas, who are the native people of the Himalayas, and they're renowned for their mountaineering skills, and they also are hired to assist with the climbers. And then they spent about a week walking to the base camp of Mount Everest, and they arrived there on April 7th. In order to attempt to summit, climbers have to acclimatize. Our bodies are not used to having so little oxygen pressure, and so we have to kind of prepare our bodies for that. So climbers will spend 2 to 3 weeks at base camp, which is at about 17,600 feet above sea level. And every day they will push themselves a little bit further up the mountain and then come back down and rest. Just basically telling their bodies, I'm doing this and you need to get ready. Besides oxygen pressure and altitude sickness, climbers have to worry about the conditions of the mountain. It's extremely cold. Around the time that they can climb, it's about -15 degrees Fahrenheit, and it's very windy. The summit of Everest is the windiest place on Earth, and they will frequently have winds of over 100 miles per hour. They don't want to climb in anything over, I think, 40, maybe 50, but that's almost a Category 1 hurricane. And the mountain's covered in ice, so they also have to worry about slipping and sliding, and they wear crampons, which are basically huge knives on the bottom of their shoes that help them stick to the ground. There are different routes you can take to get to the summit, but Beck and his expedition took the route through the South Pole, and through that route you have to pass through the Khumbu Ice Falls, which is an ever-moving glacier, and they would do this using ropes and ladders, and it shifts about 3 to 4 feet every day, so it's always different. And so they always have to keep moving things, and it's very precarious. The highest percentage of deaths that have happened at Everest by location is at the Khumbu Ice Falls. And Beck would send faxes back to his family almost nightly while he was at base camp. And Peach says that she could tell he was scared. This was out of character for him. He usually didn't ever talk to them while he was on his climbs, but this time he kept reaching out to them. And he spent their 20th anniversary there at base camp. So after they got acclimatized, they started their journey for the summit, pushing for a May 10th summit. On May 9th, they were camped at Camp 3, which is on the Lhotse face, and a man named Chen Yunnan from the Taiwanese expedition group that was going up with them forgot to put his crampons on before he left his tent in the morning. He took 2 steps out of his tent, slid and slipped off of the mountain into a crevasse and died. Beck was shaken by this. He'd never experienced somebody's death on a mountain before, but this was kind of something that everyone knew was a risk when you climb Everest, and so they just continued on. They made it up to Camp 4 that day, and they rested for a little bit. At about midnight on the 10th, the window of opportunity for them to climb opened up, and so Rob got them all moving. And they kind of teamed up with the Mountain Madness expedition because they were also pushing for that same summit, so they were just kind of like, you know, let's work together on this. Let's look out for each other in this instead of getting in the way of each other. Rob had a hard and fast turnaround time of 2 p.m. If you weren't up at the summit at 2 p.m., it didn't matter if you were 100 feet away from the summit, you were going to turn around and head back down because you weren't moving fast enough in order to get back down the mountain before nightfall. And you didn't want to be up above Camp 4 in the death zone past nightfall. The death zone is anything above 26,000 feet, and it's believed no one is able to acclimatize past that. And so once you enter the death zone, you are slowly suffocating and dying. Every step up there is a struggle and a fight. You would take a step and catch your breath, and then you would take another step. And so climbing up this part was very long and grueling. It took a lot of time and energy. So in order to combat the lack of oxygen, climbers will take tanks with them, and the Sherpas will take up stashes of tanks to leave in certain spots for them to exchange their tank with. And this is to combat, you know, the lack of oxygen, but it's also burdensome. It's more weight that you have to carry. It's more strain on your body to have these oxygen tanks. So there's pros and cons. Beck started off the push for the summit strong. He was fourth in line of about 30 people. But when he got to about 1,500 feet above Camp 4, his vision started to blur and he started not being able to focus on anything. And so he quickly fell to the back. He was letting people pass by him because he just couldn't see. Because of his recent surgery, the altitude affected the corneas of his eyes, causing them to flatten and thicken and making him nearsighted again. These effects hadn't really been studied at the time, so it wasn't known that this would happen. He wanted to keep climbing though, and he knew that once the sun came out, he'd be able to focus again. And when the sun started to rise, his vision did start to improve, so he started the ascent again. But then around 7:30, he went to wipe his face, and he had ice on his glove, and it scratched his right eye, and it affected his vision again. His whole right eye was blurry, and he had no depth perception. And so he knew that he had to stop again. He had reached the balcony and he believed that as the sun got higher and higher, it would help improve his vision again, or, maybe his eye would kind of adjust to it. But he was just really hoping that his vision would improve. He didn't want to give up this climb. So he told Rob that once his vision cleared, he would start heading up after them again. And Rob did not like this idea at all. He told Beck he had a half an hour to either have his vision cleared or he wasn't going to be climbing any higher that day. And so then Beck says, well, if in half an hour my vision's not cleared, then I'll just start going down the mountain again. But Rob didn't like this idea any better because he would have no way of knowing if Beck made it back to camp or what had happened to him. So Rob made Beck promise that he would stay right there and wait for Rob to get back from the summit. And Beck saw the logic in this, and so he agreed. So Beck just sat there at the balcony waiting for either his vision to clear or for Rob to get back, and his vision didn't clear enough in time for him to continue the ascent, so he sat there and waited. At around noon, 3 members from his expedition had turned around because there was a bottleneck at a section called the Hillary Step. There were too many people. It was moving too slow for them to be able to make the summit by the turnaround time. So they just decided to just go back to camp. They offered to take Beck back with them, but Beck refused because of his promise to Rob. He expected Rob to get to him around 3, but 3 came and went and there was no sign of Rob. So he just continued to sit there and wait, hoping that they'd be by soon. At around 5, John Krakauer came and he talked to Beck for a little bit. He let him know that Rob was still at the summit. And Mike Groom, who was another expedition guide, was only about a half hour back. And John offered to help Beck down, but Beck could tell that John was extremely exhausted and there was no way that he could help him. So he told John that he was just wait for Mike because there was no way that Rob was going to get to him before nightfall now. And so that whole promise was null. At around 5:30, Mike did arrive, but he was heavily assisting another of their group, Yasuko Namba, and she was not doing well at all. But luckily, soon after that, members from the Mountain Madness expedition had shown up and they were doing much better. And so Neil Beetleman, one of the guides from Mountain Madness, started assisting Yasuko down. So Mike short roped Beck, and so they both had a rope tied around their waist and they were about 20 feet apart. And so Beck was ahead of Mike, so Mike could be kind of like an anchor for him. On the way back down, Beck misstepped and slipped. And as he did, it pulled the rope taut and it pulled Mike down with him. And so they both started sliding down the mountain. So they both grabbed their axes and they jammed them into the mountain and they rolled all of their weight on it to stop their slide. And they had to do this 2 or 3 more times, but they were finally able to stop themselves. And Mike described that situation as somewhat unnerving. So they got back up, and Beck had only suffered some rips in his down suit. So they weren't injured, and they were able to continue the walk. They reached the South Col and were maybe about an hour away of easy traverse to the high camp. And so they just knew they were home free. But then they heard a rumble surge up the mountain, and within moments they were engulfed in an icy storm of snow and wind and cold. The temperature dropped drastically. They were constantly getting pelted. They couldn't see anything. They couldn't even see the person right next to them. And they held on to each other. They all kind of grabbed on and they stayed together as a pack and started to move because they wanted to get out of the storm. But soon they lost all sense of direction. They had no idea where they were going. And then suddenly Neil just shouted, "Stop, something's wrong." So they all stopped, and it's a good thing they did because later they found out that they were only 25 feet away from slipping off the Kingshung face. So they all sat down and just decided to try to wait out the storm for a little bit. And the wind was about 80 miles per hour, so about, again, level 1 hurricane speeds. And then there was a momentary break in the storm, and one of the climbers from the Mountain Madness group looked up and said, "I've seen the stars. I know where camp is." And so anyone who could make it on their own, they decided to get together and find camp and try to get help. There was no way for them to assist the ones who couldn't get back on their own. So if you couldn't get back on your own, you just had to sit and wait and hope that help was coming for you. And those 4 who were left behind were Beck, Yasuko Namba, Sandy Pullman, and Charlotte Fox. As the others started to leave, another from the Mountain Madness named Tim, he said, "I can't leave without Charlotte. I'm staying here." And everyone kind of was under the assumption that if you stayed, you were dead. So it's just sad, but it's also sweet that he wouldn't leave her. And Yasuko grabbed Neil's arm as he pulled away, and she's just pleading with him to not leave her. But he had to, so he pulled himself free and they left. So the 4 that were left sat there quietly hoping, praying that help was going to be coming. And they knew that they couldn't fall asleep. They were getting tired, they were very hurt, they were in a lot of pain, but they knew that to fall asleep would be to die. So they would kick each other, they would keep talking, they would just keep each other awake, just hoping for that help to arrive. And Beck started having a sense of floating and disconnect from his body. And he said it wasn't unpleasant. Beck doesn't remember this, but Sandy said she saw him stand up and walk over and say, "Okay, I've got it all figured out." And then he fell down and nobody saw him again after that. Anatoly Bukharev, who was a guide with the Mountain Madness expedition, he had climbed Everest by himself, for himself, without oxygen. He went up, tagged the summit, and came back down. So he'd been back at the camp for a while. And then the others did make it back to camp and said that there were others that needed help from their expedition. So Anatoly went out 3 times in search of Scott Fisher, who was the leader of the Mountain Madness expedition group, and the other members of his expedition. And on that 3rd attempt, he did find their little group, and he rescued Charlotte, Tim, and Sandy and took them all back to the camp. And nobody really knows why he didn't go back for Beck or Yasuko. He died Christmas Day the following year in an avalanche on Annapurna. And he had told 3 different stories about that, so nobody really knows what it was, why he didn't go back. But the fact that he saved 3 people, I don't think that deserves any less than hero status. On the morning of the 11th, after wind speeds had died down, Stuart Hutchison, who was part of Beck's expedition group, went out with 3 Sherpas in search of Beck and Yasuko. And he was a doctor, so they did find them, but when they did, he looked at them, he saw that they were in a comatose state, and once you get to that point, you just don't come back. Even though they were still alive, they were left there because the storm was still going on, and it was a risk for them to try to pull somebody back if they were just gonna die anyway. Then around 4 p.m., Beck just woke up. And at first he thought he was in his warm bed back in Dallas, and he saw his family as clear as day in front of him. But as he started to become more alert, he realized that he wasn't at home in his bed. He was on Everest still, and he looked at his hand and it was frozen solid. And he hit it on a rock and it just bounced off like wood. But it did a really good job at waking him up and gave him the focus to get him to move back to camp. And the whole time it was just the vision of his family, the thought of never seeing them again, that drove him to make it back to camp. And he made it back to camp. He was stumbling and falling, but he made it. And the people who saw him were just surprised. They were shocked. He was a dead man walking. And so they put him in Scott Fisher's tent. Scott did not make it back. He was, again, the leader from the Mountain Madness expedition. So they put Beck in Scott's tent with 2 sleeping bags and warm water bottles underneath his arms to kind of try to warm him up a little, but they were still under the impression that he was gonna die. He wasn't gonna make it. There was no way for him to recover from this. They just expected him to kind of go back into his coma and die. So nobody checked on him all through the night or all through the next day. And their expedition team headed back down the mountain, and then the IMAX expedition group got up there. And Beck awoke again, and he called out for help. And John Krakauer, who hadn't left yet, came in and saw Beck and was again surprised that he was still alive. He had been referred to as the dead guy in the tent all that day, but he was still alive and becoming more and more alert. And so with help from the IMAX expedition, he was able to make it down to Camp 1, but he couldn't get past the Khumbu ice falls with no hands. And Peach had been told he was dead, and then a few hours later, they called her again and said, well, he's not as dead as we thought, but they kind of didn't want to let her hopes up. They still fully expected him to die. But Peach was not going to let that happen. She did everything in her power to organize a rescue for him. And she was told several times that it couldn't be done. No helicopter had ever flown that high for a rescue. But she just would not take no for an answer. And she called governors, she called just everyone trying to organize this rescue. And eventually she got into contact with Colonel Madden Casey of the Nepal Army Air Force, and he volunteered, saying that he would at least try. This would be an extremely dangerous rescue. You're flying at the upper limits of everything. And if he landed and couldn't start up the helicopter again, he was a dead man. It required expert flying and precision and luck, honestly. And he went up with his co-pilot the first time, but the co-pilot was just like, no, we have to go back. We have to turn around. We can't do this. It can't be done. And so Madden said, well, I'm going to try. And he left the co-pilot as much gear as possible and left with 20 minutes of fuel. But there was another man who had survived the night, like Beck, above the death zone, and he was unable to walk. Beck gave up his spot on the helicopter for this man because he didn't want to second guess himself for the rest of his life. And he knew that the helicopter wasn't going to be coming back. So he was basically giving up his life in order to try to save this other man. And the helicopter went away, and he just kind of was in there in a somber silence. And then 5 minutes later, he heard the propeller of the helicopter heading back up the mountain. And the helicopter came up, lightly touched down on the icefall, and Beck jumped in the back. And then the helicopter just flew right back down the mountain. And they went to base camp, and they picked up the other survivor, co-pilot, gear, fuel. And Beck was told that the pilot, when he got there, had only 7 minutes left of fuel in the tank. And so he really risked everything in order to save Beck. And the reason he'd gone back for Beck is because Beck was the reason that he was there in the first place. So he knew he couldn't just rescue one person and leave Beck. 8 people died in the storm. 4 of them were from Adventure Consultants Expedition Group. They were Doug Hansen, Rob Hall, Yosuke Namba, and Andy Harris. Then there was Scott Fisher of the Mountain Madness Expedition Group. And forgive my pronunciation, this is probably not how these names are said at all, but there was also Dorje Marup, Tsoeng Samanla, and Tsoeng Paljor from the Indo-Tibetan Border Police Expedition, and they were traveling from the North Face. Probably the most famous body of Everest that's used as a landmark is that of Green Boots, and that is believed to be the body of Tsoeng Paljor. After Beck's rescue, he recovered back in Dallas at home. It took several months for them to know how much of his extremities would be lost. At first, they thought he was just going to lose his right hand and the fingertips on his left hand, but he ended up losing most of his right forearm and all of the fingers on his left hand. He also had to have skin grafts across his face, over his nose. He lost the skin of his nose. But this wasn't the only thing that changed in Beck's life. He also was determined to be a new man. He became more focused on his family and Peach. Peach had decided when he left for Everest that when he got back, she was going to leave him. But with everything that happened, she decided that she was going to give him a year to prove that he was a changed man. But it only took months after his return for Beck's resolve to be tested. Peach's brother, who was extremely close to their family, their children saw him as their father figure. He was the one that was always there for them. He and Peach were extremely close. In August that year, he was diagnosed with cancer, and it was a terminal diagnosis. And Beck was not only there for Peach, but he really stepped up in taking care of his brother-in-law and taking initiative into trying to find a way for him to continue this fight, or trying to find a way for him to be cured. Sadly, her brother still did pass away. He was not able to beat cancer, but Beck had shown that he truly had changed. And so Peach decided to stay with him. In the year 2000, Beck wrote his autobiography, Left for Dead, My Journey Home from Everest. And he's been depicted in several movies and documentaries since this time. John Krakauer also wrote a book called Into Thin Air, and that is the book that these movies are based off of, because they showed the whole expedition's story, not just Beck's. And in the latest version, the movie Everest that came out in 2015, Beck was played by Josh Brolin. Today, Beck is 75 years old, and from what I can tell, he still works as a pathologist at Medical City Dallas Hospital, and he is also now a motivational speaker. I'm not sure how what happened affected his depression and his mental health. I know he does have this new lease on life, and he says it saved his marriage and his relationship with his family. And for that reason, he would do it all again. I think this is an amazing story of survival. Somebody who, for no reason, should be alive today. Just, it's a miracle that he's still alive. And I'm so happy that he has learned the lessons that he needed through this experience, and he was able to better his relationships with his family and his loved ones, because those are the people who are truly important in our lives. And I'm just glad that this story ended happily, because oftentimes they don't. And I wanted to share a story that did end happily. So that's why I chose this one today. And like I said, next time I will be covering another story from this expedition and another side of it. And that one isn't so happy, so enjoy this. But anyway, that's all I have for today. Thank you guys for watching, and I will see you in the next video.